and we're going to start with this topic. New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard will be the first transgender athlete in history to compete at the Olympics this summer. Since 2015, the International Olympic Committee has allowed trans athletes to compete in women's categories if their testosterone levels are below a certain level. Now, there's lots of debate over this news. Sherry, let's start with you. What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly, first of all, first red flag, when the Olympic Committee or anybody else has excluded folk, that has a sordid past. I mean, we remember that Black athletes were kept out because they were considered genetically superior. So there's that. A second red flag, there's no science behind any of this. There was a great article in Scientific American just back in March where they were quoted as saying that testosterone really doesn't give you much of an advantage at all. In fact, 10% of cisgendered women have more than average testosterone in their systems. And you know, puberty blockers, all that trans women have to go through to become trans women puts them, if anything, at a disadvantage. And remember, since 2004, the Olympics have been open to receiving trans athletes, trans women athletes, and this is the very first one that has actually made the grade. So, and finally, the final, you know, red flag I would say is this is an incredibly beleaguered, marginalized community. 50% suicide rate, 50% poverty rate. Why would we want to marginalize them, and particularly girl children, trans girl children, any more than they're already marginalized? In one state that's actually brought this in, you know, it's led to, you know, other teenage athletes accusing their female trans friends of, or just their female friends of not being real women enough. I mean, so this leads to testing and, you know, so what we're looking at and the way this is playing out on the ground is nothing short of transphobia, and that's sad.
But Cher, can you see how some of Hubbard's competitors who support her identity 100% but still feel like she may have an unfair advantage? Did you have any sympathy at all for that? Because there was another recent study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that found that after a year of hormone therapy among trans women athletes, on average, they still had an advantage over cisgendered women.
Well, I mean, there's studies and other studies, right? But the science is in. Again, I would just direct people to Scientific American, where they look at all the studies and discover that really there's not, obviously there's not that great advantage. This is the first trans person who's got through. Now, I mean, the Olympic Committee also looks at other things, and you heard, you know, some of those other factors they look at in weight categories, for example. But again, you know, this is not a great past, and I mean, you could argue that Black athletes have a genetic superiority. I mean, do you see where this is going? I mean, this is not pretty. So again, I think we have to look at the reality, the science behind it, and I think we also have to, you know, be very aware this is affecting our children. Because that's where sports starts, especially elite sports. And what that leads to is name calling. It leads to further marginalization of already marginalized groups. So, you know, again, and it's been proven. I mean, again, they've been open to this since 2004. This is the first trans athlete. We're talking about a very small group in terms of population numbers. So, yeah, please err on the side of inclusion and acceptance and compassion.
I hear everything you're saying, Sherry, and I've always taken issue. I'm not a sporty person, and I've always questioned and wondered about gender separations, period, in the sports world and how pronounced they are in spaces where everywhere else everyone's saying, let's be equal and let's have diversity. It's never made a lot of sense to me. I do think that people are going to be watching this particular situation very closely, and I can't imagine the pressure that Laurel is under. You know, on the one hand, if she cleans up, if she does really, really well, that's going to say something to certain people. If she doesn't do very well, that's also going to say something for other people. So basically, she can only be in a Goldilocks position. She's got to kind of do just good enough in order for this to just sort of maybe be a non-issue for many people. So that's a huge amount of pressure. I mean, I do think it's interesting to unpack some details about this as well, because the peak age, apparently for weightlifting, is apparently 26 years old for men and 25 years old for women. Laurel happens to be 43 years old. So I wonder in this case, if she were in her prime and she was competing against women in their prime as well, would that shake out differently? I mean, if all goes well, though, if this ends up being this Goldilocks situation, at some point it really does beg the question, why do we have any gendered separations in sport anymore? Why don't we make competitions based on maybe body size, maybe background, maybe age? Maybe there's all different factors that we start looking at everything through a different lens. And I think that's exciting.
It's interesting. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question to ask. I don't know how quickly we're going to get there because it's radical what you're saying, Cynthia, although it gives us a lot to think about. While we still have gender in sports, men competing against men and women competing against women, let's be honest here, this is targeting women. This is specifically targeting very specific types of women. Women who don't often look like what other people think a woman should look like. That's first and foremost. And how come when a woman excels, the first reaction is, whoa, 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 we got to hold her back and figure out why is she so good? Whereas with men competing, it's like the better, the faster, the stronger, the better. And I look at a Washington Post article that was written a few years ago, and in it, the writers wrote about Michael Phelps, the Marvel, versus Caster Semenya. They said, a lot of people calling her the mutant. And why? Because they were equally being looked at for their genetic differences, but one was being hailed as a hero and the other one was being hailed as some kind of freak. Like, that's what people were calling her, and way worse. So why is it that we celebrate genetic differences in men who excel in athletics? Nobody ever told Michael Phelps, you actually need surgery to fix those double-jointed ankles that make you swim so fast. Actually, the fact that you produce like half of the lactic acid than any other athlete, you should probably take drugs.
We just pat him on the back and say, yeah, we don't talk about it being fair or not. You're totally right with Michael Phelps or his height. It's just like you hit the genetic jackpot, bud. Like, that's it.
Yeah. And we celebrated him and said he's amazing. And yet with Caster Semenya, as you know, she is that runner from South Africa. She's an intersex woman. And she was subjected to humiliating tests to prove that she was woman enough because people took issue with her being so good on the track. I got a real issue with all of this.
Mm-hmm. And not to mention that if we look to your point about, gendered sports generally, I mean, if you look at the financing that goes into male sports and, from teenage years up, to women's sports, it's dramatically different, right? Why don't we look at why are women's sports not supported more financially? Why do we not support our women athletes more? Let's look at those issues if we want to look at gender. Why are those issues off the table? And yeah, I mean, of course, we look at men, we don't look at genetic differences. I mean, why don't they exclude, men who are 7 feet tall from basketball? It's an unfair advantage. I mean,
exactly.
So these genetic differences and markers are always, I mean, that's why I say it's suspect. It's suspect from the get-go. And it's even more suspect when you think about the effect it has on our children. Right?
Well, it's also suspect because, the opponents of this are making it sound like this is every single athlete. Like, one trans athlete in a sport is going to lead to everybody deciding that their gender has to change so that they can go win Olympic medals, which completely misunderstands what trans is, that it's not a choice, first of all, but also that it would be a snap of a finger decision. And that is the epidemic or whatever that, people have to protect against. When, as you said, Sherry, this is one athlete in one sport. It's a very small amount of people. And the alarmism that's out there is so exaggerated that that's suspect, that they're working for a nefarious gain.
Yeah. And, as a feminist from way back, and when we think about women's rights and we think about women, I mean, again, this focus on one woman, this focus on women generally, this is when that voice, patriarchy has sort of attacked us in every other way, and we're winning, and we've won a lot of freedoms, let's face it, in the last, half century. This is another way of getting at us. So I think for cisgender women, we should be very concerned and stand up for our trans sisters, because this is the thin edge of the wedge against women's rights generally. Really, they've lost that war. They're losing that war. But here's a way of kind of keeping the action on the battlefield. And I say, no, let's call it out.